caste system in Augusta was, I think it's very difficult for us to even empathise, to even understand. The example I usually give is when Georgiana Molloy gave birth to her first baby in that tent on the beach, and she looked in the encyclopedia to find out what to do when things didn't go normally and the afterbirth didn't appear, and she realised that if there was not some form of human intervention she would probably die. She refused to let her servant do what was necessary, even though she knew exactly what needed to be done. She refused because her servant was not a lady. And I think that brings it home to us, that it was something that was so deeply felt that the group of settlers who were here in those early years were really very much a microcosm of British life, the British life that they'd left behind. We can't say that they had the nobility, although in a sense they did, because eventually they had Sir James Stirling. But they had the gentry. When Charles Bussell described the people who'd arrived here, and he said that apart from the military and the surgeon, that the Molloys and the Bussells themselves were the only gentle settlers, he meant gentlemen, gentry, as in landed gentry. The two words go together always, don't they, in Britain? Landed gentry. If you've got land, you're a gentleman. And those boundaries, this is the Hillman survey, I think it's 1833, 1834. Those boundaries were all important because they marked out, look how big my land is, this is how successful I am, this is what I've achieved, this is how cultured I am, this is what a gentleman or a lady I am. The three families who, in many ways, left us the greatest amount of evidence were definitely the Molloys, the Turners and the Bussells, because they wrote so profusely. And it's a shame that there isn't more. There is writing that's available from other folks, but certainly not in the same dimensions and amounts as the letters that the Bussells, the Molloys, and the Turners wrote. In particular, the Bussells, they wrote a great deal. But those three families, I think, provide a very interesting viewpoint for us of the way that the gentlefolks and the others related between one another. And we can say that each of those three families had something that the others wanted or needed, but could never actually achieve. So if we think about, for example, John Molloy, the Molloy family, Molloy had the highest status in the settlement. He didn't have very much money. He had a sort of okay kind of income, but it wasn't much. He was on half pay from the army, and whatever the government were paying him to be government resident and resident magistrate. So he had some money, but he had the highest status. The Bussells had no money. They were as poor as church mice, and more of that in a minute. That made a huge difference to their lives. It impacted on everything for the Bussells. But they had education. They had a high level of education that John Molloy certainly could never even compete with. I just want to read you very quickly a description of John Garrett Bussell and his writing that was in a book published in London, A Manual for Emigrants to the Settlement or Its Dependencies, the Colony of Western Australia, Principles of Colonial Emigration. It says, the following journal by Mr. Bussell, now settled at La Vasse, gives a natural and vivid description of a part of the coast which has never before been described. Mr. Bussell is known by his friends to be an excellent classic, we might say classicist. The writer was much struck on finding on the blank pages of this journal quotations from Aristotle and definitions of rhetoric. The emanations of genius alone survive the wrecks of empires. John Molloy could never hope to be an educated person in that way. We can find the misspellings in his writing and some of the not quite grammatical things that he wrote. And John Garrett Bussell would have been aware of that. James Woodward Turner had more money than the rest of them put together. He had more money than probably all of them. But James Woodward Turner could not get the status that he had left behind in London. He couldn't get the status, he couldn't get the respect from the other settlers of being a gentleman, because he was not seen as part of the gentry. You'll remember that Charles Bussell wrote home and said that James Woodward Turner was a nice little Cockney builder. Yes, a nice little Cockney builder. I have to say to you that if we use the same value judgments, we could say that Charles Bussell's grandfather was a nice little Devonshire carpenter, because he was. Joseph Bussell was a furniture maker in Exeter and Plymouth. I think it was either Vernon or Lennox who talked about Edward Pearce, their servant, as a shuffling town-bred blackguard. Well, he was town-bred. Anyway, enough